Hey guys, tonight we wander into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, where legends whisper of devices so cruel they sound like props from a horror film. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the picture of a coffin lined with spikes slowly closing on you. You probably won't survive this bedtime story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this strange little community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture the Iron Maiden as a medieval death capsule, huge, looming, a sarcophagus lined with iron spikes waiting to puncture unlucky prisoners. Cartoons exaggerated. You slam the door, squish, and instantly your victim looks like a porcupine. It's the kind of thing that makes a 12-year-old snicker and an adult mutter, "Wow, the Middle Ages were messed up." Joke 1. It's basically a medieval version of the Hotel Minibear, expensive, terrifying, and you don't really want to open it. Here's the flip. Historians now say the Iron Maiden never really existed in medieval times. The device as we know it was stitched together in the 18th and 19th centuries by collectors and showmen trying to dramatize the past. The most famous, unrelated artifacts centuries after the Middle Ages had ended. The spikes weren't medieval. They were added later to crank up the shock value for paying museum audiences. So, ironically, the Iron Maiden itself is a myth. About torture myths. The first recorded mention of an Iron Maiden wasn't until the late 1700s, long after medieval torture practices had faded. In 1890, a carnival in America featured an Iron Maiden that people could pay to peek inside, basically the haunted house of its day. Some historians argue that spiked coffins may have existed in earlier forms, but there's no conclusive medieval record. Others insist the whole thing is pure invention, a mashup of sensationalism and faulty museum practices. Now, for a mini-character POV, picture a tired Nuremberg guard in 1784, polishing the spikes of a newly discovered Iron Maiden, muttering, "Well, it's not real torture, but it'll keep the tourists paying." Joke 2. So basically, medieval torture had fan fiction writers, and their stuff got published in museums. But here's the punchline. You've been lied to, not by medieval torturers, but by Victorian showmen. The Iron Maiden isn't proof of medieval cruelty, it's proof of our modern hunger, too. Imagine the past as darker than it really was. The myth itself became torture every time a teacher repeats the story without checking sources. Another history student suffers. Callback. Remember this when we later reach the pair of anguish, because that one too might not be what you think. Joke 3. At this rate, half of medieval torture devices were just Kickstarter projects that never got funded. You imagine the rack as the ultimate medieval gym machine, except instead of six-pack abs, it gives you 6 extra feet in height. In every cartoon, a prisoner groans as their arms and legs are pulled in opposite directions, bones popping like bubble wrap. It's the sort of thing you picture in a dungeon lit only by torches and damp misery. Joke 1. It's the only workout where you don't lose weight to just gain length. But here's the flip. The rack wasn't about cartoonish dismemberment. The point wasn't to tear people apart like Tafiet was to cause *controlled pain, and extract confessions, while keeping the prisoner alive. The rack's brilliance, if you can call it that, lay in precision. By slowly tightening the rollers at each end, inquisitors could dislocate joints without killing the victim outright. Pain built gradually, and the fear of what might happen often broke the prisoner's will before the machine did. Think less splatter horror and more psychological cliffhanger. The rack was used across Europe, particularly in England and Spain, with documented cases into the 17th century. The Tower of London even had one nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's Daughter. Guy Fawkes, the man behind the gunpowder plot, was interrogated on the rack in 1605. His before and after signatures survive, showing neat handwriting at first, and then jagged scrawls after stretching. Some historians argue the rack was less common than legend suggests, used only in high-profile cases. Others think it was widespread but poorly recorded because courts didn't want posterity to see how they secured justice. Mini-character POV, picture Guy Fawkes, slumped on the rack, whispering to himself, "Next time, I'll just buy fireworks from the market." Joke 2. The rack, because medieval interrogators thought yoga needed more screaming. Punchline: the myth says the rack was about violent tearing. The truth, it was about drawing out fear slowly, making the victim imagine the tearing that might never come. The device didn't just stretch bodies, it stretched confessions, twisted testimonies, and warped the truth itself. Callback: just like the Iron Maiden was cobbled together later. The rack, too, gets exaggerated. Pop culture always makes it bloodier than it really was. Joke 3. In short, the rack was less Game of Thrones and more World's Worst Chiropractic Session. You tend to imagine torture as massive contraptions filling dungeons, iron beasts that groan when wound up. But some of the nastiest medieval devices were small enough to fit in a satchel. Enter the thumbscrews, simple clamps that crushed fingers or toes with each twist of a screw. The myth paints them as mere side tools, almost comical in their size, compared to monsters like the rack. Joke 1. There, basically the medieval version of death by paperclip. The truth is that the very simplicity of thumbscrews made them devastating. Unlike elaborate machines that required space, setup, and multiple guards, thumbscrews could be carried anywhere. A single interrogator could apply unbearable pressure on fingers, forcing a victim to confess without any grand theatrics. The sound wasn't roaring chains, but the small, sharp crunch of bone. The victim's imagination often did the rest. In fact, documented cases in Scotland and Germany describe their use during witch trials. One particularly cruel version had rough studs inside, so each turn scraped as well as crushed. This wasn't medieval showbiz, it was quick, dirty, and efficient. Guy Fawkes may have faced the rack, but countless lesser-known prisoners had their stories squeezed out of them by nothing bigger than a fist-sized clamp. Some scholars argue that these portable devices were far more common than the museum darling machines, precisely because they left less spectacle behind. Then there's the quirky angle. Some sets of thumbscrews were modified to fit multiple fingers at once, mini pianos of pain. And, to this day, A few survive in private collections, sometimes mislabeled as carpenters' tools. Historians still argue whether they were everyday implements repurposed into instruments of torture, or purpose-built for interrogation rooms. Either way, the blurred line shows how pain could hide in plain sight. Mini-character POV. Imagine a nervous villager dragged before a witch-hunting court, staring in disbelief as the judge pulls out something that looks suspiciously like a handyman's clamp. Muttering, "You're kidding, that's it." Joke 2. Asterisk, it's proof that in the Middle Ages, even your toolbox wanted you to suffer. Asterisk, the punchline here is scale. We assume horror must be huge, noisy, and dramatic. In reality, the tiniest screws, turned slowly, could undo the strongest wills. Callback. Just like the Iron Maiden fooled us with size, and the rack with its drama. The thumb screws remind us that pain doesn't need to be big, it just needs to be relentless. Joke 3. Asterisk, in modern terms, thumbscrews are basically the medieval version of a really bad smartphone. Charger small, cheap, and guaranteed to make you cry. Asterisk, you picture it instantly, a hulking wooden chair bristling with iron spikes, waiting for some poor soul to be strapped in like a human pincushion. The myth says victims were thrown onto it and impaled instantly, the spikes punching through skin like thumbtacks through paper. It sounds so theatrical you almost imagine a crowd applauding. Joke 1. Asterisk, basically, the medieval version of Please Have a Seat, with extra attitude. Asterisk, the truth is less cinematic, but far more chilling. The chair of nails wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was built to terrify and prolong. Prisoners were forced to sit on it while strapped tightly, their weight pressing down slowly against dozens or even hundreds of spikes. The pain came not in one dramatic moment, but over long, agonizing hours. Often the spikes weren't even sharp enough to pierce deeply. They were blunted, designed more to bruise and scratch than to stab. This meant the victim bled slowly, if at all, but never escaped the sharp reminder of what could happen if they resisted. One mainstream historical account notes that versions of this chair appeared in several parts of Europe, including Germany and Italy, often paired with iron restraints that prevented the prisoner from shifting their body. A quirky detail: some chairs were heated with fire from below, turning the spikes into miniature branding irons that seared flesh at every point of contact. And historians still argue whether these chairs were used widely or mostly displayed as symbols of authority, psychological weapons as much as physical ones. The image of sitting in such a chair wasn't just about pain, but humiliation. To be tied up, unable to move, forced to endure slowly deepening wounds, was a form of breaking the spirit in public trials. It was the opposite of the rack's noisy drama. It was silent, slow, and suffocating. Joke 2. Asterisk, you thought IKEA chairs were uncomfortably, at least those only attack your lower back, not your entire dignity. Asterisk, the punchline is that the chair of nails wasn't built for instant gore, but for the suspense of waiting. Victims lived with the unbearable knowledge that every twitch made things worse. And here's the callback. Just as the thumbscrews taught us that small tools can dominate, the chair of nails shows that even sitting down, a gesture of comfort, can be turned into torture. Joke 3. Asterisk, if you've ever sat through a 3-hour staff meeting in a bad office chair, congratulations, you've survived the budget version. Asterisk, you've probably seen the story, a massive bronze bull, hollow on the inside, with a hatch for dropping victims. The myth says a fire was lit beneath it, roasting the prisoner alive, while their screams echoed through the pipes, emerging from the bull's mouth as the sound of a roaring animal. It's one of those tales that feels too perfectly theatrical, too gruesomely poetic, like something a playwright invented for shock value. Joke 1. Asterisk, basically the first surround sound system. Asterisk, now the flip. The brazen bull is one of the most debated torture devices in history. Some accounts place its invention in ancient Greece under the tyrant Phalaris of Akrigas, not in the Middle Ages at all. The story claims a craftsman named Perillos built it for the tyrant, only to be the bull's first victim as a cruel test. But when medieval chroniclers later dug up such stories, they folded them into their own catalogues of cruelty. By the Renaissance, writers were confidently presenting the bull as a medieval staple, even though the evidence for its use in Europe's dungeons is flimsy at best. Still, the image was powerful. Travelers' reports, pamphlets, and later museum displays turned the bull into a kind of mascot of cruelty, proof of humanity's darkest creativity. Yet surviving artifacts are suspiciously absent. What we mostly have are drawings, retellings, and hearsays of storytelling that blur fact and fiction. The myth became stronger than any physical evidence. One historical fact often cited, Roman writers like Diodorus Siculus did describe such a device in Sicily, which lent credibility to later claims. A quirky detail adds colorsome versions insisted the bull's pipes were engineered to turn screams into music-like notes, as if the victim's suffering became an instrument. And here lies the scholarly debate. Was the bull ever actually constructed, or was it simply a moral fable passed down to illustrate tyranny's cruelty? Many modern historians lean toward the latter, suggesting that even if a prototype once existed, its medieval fame was largely built on repetition, not reality. The psychological impact, though, was real enough. To imagine being locked inside a giant metal beast, roasted alive, while people outside admired the sculpted calm of the bull's face, that fear was enough to terrify audiences across centuries. The brazen bull became less a device and more a symbol, a story that kept people awake at night, wondering just how far human cruelty could go. Joke 2. Asterisk. Forget hot yoga. This was the ultimate sweated-out session. Asterisk. And the punchline. Whether the brazen bull ever roasted real victims or not, it has roasted imaginations for nearly 2,000 years. The myth endured because it was unforgettable, a golden animal that sang with human screams. Callback time. Just like the Iron Maiden, the brazen bull proves how much of our picture of medieval torture comes from stories stitched together later, not always from the blood-soaked reality we think we know. Joke 3. Asterisk. If your barbecue grill has ever gone wrong, congratulations, you've just invented the backyard brazen bull. You probably see it in your head already. A giant wooden wheel, a victim tied to it, like a twisted carnival ride, bones snapping one by one as a hammer comes down. The myth says it was all about immediate, spectacular destruction, bodies shattered in seconds for cheering crowds. Joke 1. Asterisk. It was basically the least fun version of Spin the Wheel. Asterisk. The truth is darker and slower. The The wheel wasn't meant to kill quickly. Prisoners were tied across its spokes, limbs stretched awkwardly, and then methodically broken with iron bars. But often, instead of finishing the job, executioners left the victim alive, woven into the wheel like part of its frame. Sometimes the wheel was propped up on posts, displaying the body alive or barely alive for the public to see. The agony could last for hours, even days. This wasn't just punishment. It was theater, a performance that sent a message: defy authority, and you'll become a spectacle of pain. One historical fact stands out: accounts from France and Germany. A quirky tidbit: some condemned criminals were shown a bit of mercy by having their chest struck first to end life quickly. But others weren't so lucky. Sometimes the crowd demanded a full show. Historians still argue whether the wheel was primarily used as torture before execution or as the execution itself. In many cases, it blurred into both, with the punishment lingering long after bones had been broken. What made the wheel terrifying wasn't only the pain, but the helplessness. Bound to an object larger than yourself, you became part of the machine, turned into a warning display. Unlike the rack's private stretching or the chair of nails confined silence, the wheel was about spectacle. Tired towns could witness your unraveling. Joke 2. Asterisk. Imagine having to be the poor medieval guy assigned to wheel repair. Talk about the world's worst mechanic job. Asterisk. The punchline is simple. The myth says the wheel was a quick shatter. The reality is that it was about dragging pain into the open, making it last, and making sure everyone else remembered it. Callback. Remember how the brazen bull turned screams into a performance? The wheel did the same, except here the music was the sound of silence between each sickening crack. Joke 3. Asterisk. If you thought modern Ferris wheels were scary, at least they don't come with an executioner. Asterisk. You've heard the myth: a cruel little device shaped like a metal fruit, inserted into mouths, or worse, and cranked open until victims burst apart from the inside. Every creepy medieval torture list online swears it was one of the most nightmarish contraptions ever used. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically, the medieval version of this pair is definitely not organic. Asterisk. Now the flip: there's almost no evidence the pair of anguish was ever used the way popular stories claim. Surviving examples exist, yes, but most date from the early modern period, centuries after the height of medieval torture. And none come with proof that they were shoved into people and cranked open until death. Some historians argue these pairs were more likely gags, medical tools gone wrong. The cruel reputation was largely stitched together by sensationalist writers who. One documented fact is that pairs with expandable sections were indeed built, often with screws that widened their pedals outward. A quirky detail is that some were engraved or decorated, suggesting they weren't purely utilitarian, but made for display. The ongoing debate is whether these pairs were genuinely instruments of torture. Scholars still don't agree, and the absence of detailed trial records mentioning them keeps the mystery alive. What matters more is the psychological power. To show a prisoner a pair with jagged metal leaves and imply where it might go was enough to terrify. Even if the device never tore bodies apart, the idea of it could break down resistance. It's another reminder that torture often thrived on imagination as much as on physical pain. Joke 2. Asterisk. You know a device is questionable when it looks like a medieval kitchen gadget and historians can't decide if it was for torture or for stuffing sausages. Asterisk. The punchline is that the pair of anguish is less a fact of history and more a reflection of how much we want to believe in medieval brutality. Just like the Iron Maiden, the myth survives because it's too shocking to let go. Callback. Once again, the pattern repeats. When the story is scarier than the truth, the story wins. Joke 3. Asterisk. At this rate, half of medieval torture museums are basically antique shops with better lighting. Asterisk. You picture a medieval dungeon filled with heavy chains, rusted shackles. The myth says these restraints were flimsy enough that daring heroes could wriggle free or smash them dramatically against the wall. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically, every dungeon scene from Hollywood assumes prisoners had access to stunt doubles and lockpicking classes. Asterisk. Now the flip medieval chains and shackles were usually brutally effective, not theatrical props. Forged by blacksmiths with the same care as weapons, they were designed to be heavy, uncomfortable, and humiliating. Many weren't about escape-proofing so much as breaking dignity. Shackles could be tight enough to cut circulation or awkwardly shaped so you could never stand, sit, or lie down comfortably. Prisoners weren't expected to fight their way free. They were expected to slowly weaken under the weight of iron that clung like a second skin. Records from England's Tower of London mention Bilbo's iron bars with holes for ankles, locking multiple prisoners in place together. A quirky example comes from Nuremberg, where oversized shackles were built intentionally heavier than necessary, almost ceremonial weights to show off authority. And historians still argue whether some of the most grotesque sets on display today were actually used on living prisoners or were symbolic punishments displayed as warnings. The debate points to one truth, whether practical or theatrical. Their purpose was humiliation above all. What makes dungeon restraints chilling is how ordinary they looked. Unlike the rack or the wheel, they weren't flashy. They were part of the everyday architecture of punishment, blending into the stones and shadows of the prison itself. You couldn't romanticize them because they were constant. Day and night, every move you made reminded you of your captivity. Joke 2. Asterisk. If you think modern handcuffs are uncomfortable, imagine being shackled in medieval iron that doubled as your roommate. Asterisk. The punchline is that the myth of easy escapes belongs to Hollywood, not history. Real prisoners weren't heroes slipping locks. They were human beings ground down by weight, bruises, and time. Callback. Just like the chair of nails turned sitting into torture, dungeon shackles turned simple existence, walking, sleeping, breathing, into punishment. Joke 3. Asterisk. Honestly, the only medieval prisoners who ever escaped shackles were the ones Hollywood cast as wizards. Asterisk. The myth is brutal. Prisoners dunked into cauldrons of boiling oil or water, bubbling away while crowds cheered. It's the kind of story that makes medieval Europe sound like one endless witch's stewpot. You can almost smell the cauldron smoke wafting out of some grimy dungeon. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically, the Middle Ages turned dinner prep into a spectator sport. Asterisk. Now, the flip boiling punishments did exist, but they were rare, often tied to very specific crimes. Unlike the rack or the wheel, which were structured tools of interrogation or execution, Boiling alive was mostly about spectacle and sending a political message. England's King Henry VIII, for instance, authorized boiling as punishment for poisoning in the 1530s. The idea was less about practical law enforcement and more about shocking the public into obedience. A recorded case tells of a cook named Richard Roos accused of poisoning a pot of porridge. Instead of a hanging, he was plunged into a cauldron of boiling liquid, as the law demanded, his cries echoing as a warning to anyone tempted by similar crimes. Quirky detail: some sources claim the punishment wasn't always oil or water. Sometimes molten substances like lead or tar were used, chosen as much for symbolism as pain. Historians still debate whether these cases were isolated performances, or whether they hinted at a broader but undocumented practice. What's certain is that it was never as routine as legend suggests. The horror here wasn't just in the method, but in its public nature. To watch a human body lowered into a pot in a city square was to watch the line between punishment and performance blur. It was a theater of fear, staged to make an entire community recoil. Joke 2, asterisk. Imagine telling people you were executed for bad cooking. Talk about getting roasted twice. Asterisk, the punchline. The myth says boiling alive was common in the Middle Ages. Like every town had a cauldron ready by the gates. The truth is that it was reserved for rare, symbolic punishments, so unusual that the records stand out. Callback. Just like the pair of anguish survives more in legend than reality, boiling lingers more as a story than as a daily practice. Joke 3, asterisk. Honestly, the only people who should have been boiled were whoever decided pineapple belonged on pizza. Asterisk, you've probably seen it in creepy old sketches. A metal cage clamped over the head, with an iron bit shoved into the mouth to stop speech. The myth paints it as a gag prop, straight out of dark comedy, like a medieval muzzle for nagging wives. Joke 1, asterisk. Basically the worst Bluetooth headset in history. Asterisk. Now, the Flip the Scold's bridle, also called the Brank, was very real, and its cruelty wasn't funny at all. It wasn't designed for silent torture chambers, but for public humiliation. Women accused of gossiping, scolding, or disturbing the peace were paraded through streets wearing it. The mouthpiece often had spikes that pressed on the tongue, so any attempt to talk led to bleeding. Far from comedy, it was a weapon of shame, reinforcing power and silence in a society that punished women's voices more than men's crimes. One historical fact: records from Scotland and England describe the use of bridles well into the 17th century. A quirky tidbit: some versions had bells attached so that every movement drew attention, making the punishment not just silent, but loudly humiliating. Historians still debate whether the bridle was more symbolic than functional. Some believe many examples were built for display as threats, while others argue they saw regular use in smaller towns eager to control reputations. Unlike the rack or the wheel, this device wasn't about extracting confessions or ending lives. It was about enforcing silence in the most literal, degrading way possible. By forcing someone to wear the bridle in public, the punishment spread beyond the victim. It warned every onlooker what could happen if they spoke too freely. Joke 2, asterisk. Forget cancel culture. This was the medieval version of mute button. Asterisk. The punchline is that the scold's bridle wasn't a quirky gag at all. It was psychological torture disguised as justice, aimed primarily at women, embedding silence into their daily lives. Callback. Just like shackles turned simple movement into punishment, the bridle turned something as basic as speaking into a crime. Joke 3. Asterisk. Some people think modern headphones are uncomfortable least they don't stab your tongue when you try to sing along. The myth feels familiar. A medieval prisoner strapped down while endless buckets of water splash onto their face, drowning them drop by drop. Most people picture a medieval version of modern waterboarding, a kind of sadistic swimming lesson nobody survives. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically, the Middle Ages invented spa day without the spa or the day, just the misery. Asterisk. Now the flipwater torture did exist, but it was more theatrical and varied than the single image pop culture gives us. Some forms involved steady dripping on the forehead, creating an unbearable illusion of endless drilling. Others involved partial submersion, dunking the victim in barrels or rivers until panic set in. There were also accounts of forced water consumption, prisoners made to swallow impossible amounts until their stomachs felt ready to burst. Rather than being standardized like the rack, water methods were improvised, adapted to circumstance, and aimed at manipulating both body and mind. A historical fact: during the Spanish Inquisition, documented techniques included pouring water through cloth placed over the mouth and nose, simulating drowning, a practice that closely resembles modern waterboarding. A quirky detail: in some French cases, water barrels were placed in public squares, turning interrogation into a civic spectacle where townsfolk could watch the dunking. And historians still debate whether Chinese water tortured, the famous image of dripping on the forehead, was ever medieval at all, or a later exaggeration pinned on the era to amplify its cruelty. Water's power lay in its familiarity. Everyone knew what it meant to drown, to choke, to gasp for breath. Using water turned survival instinct against the victim, producing terror without necessarily leaving lasting scars. Unlike the wheel or the brazen bull, it didn't require elaborate machinery, just buckets, cloth, or a riverbank. Joke 2. Asterisk. Some medieval prisoners probably thought, "Great, I finally get a bath," before realizing it came with bonus panic attacks. Asterisk. The punchline: water torture shows that cruelty didn't always need iron and spikes. Sometimes the simplest element, the thing you drink every day, became the most horrifying weapon. Callback. Just like boiling alive turned cooking pots into execution stages, water tortures blurred survival and suffering until both felt the same. Joke 3. Asterisk. If you've ever had a leaky ceiling drip all night, congratulations, you've already survived the medieval deluxe edition. Myth is as grim as it gets. Medieval executioners peeling the skin off living victims, leaving them screaming skeletons of muscle and blood. Popular imagination insists it was common, a go-to punishment for traitors, heretics, or anyone unlucky enough to displease the wrong lord. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically, the medieval version of peeling an apple, except nobody wanted a slice. Asterisk. Now, the flip-flaying alive was far less common than legend makes it seem. Accounts exist, yes, but they're often shrouded in exaggeration or outright myth-making. Chroniclers loved gory tales, and describing enemies being flayed alive added dramatic flair to their stories. In reality, Confirmed cases are rare and often tied more to political theater than routine justice. Some historians suggest the very idea of flaying became more valuable as a threat than as an actual practice. A historical fact: one of the most famous alleged cases comes from the 15th century, when the Flemish nobleman Peter of Hagenbach was executed and his skin supposedly nailed to a city gate as a warning. A quirky detail is that some accounts describe flayed skins stretched like parchment. Whether true or not, the imagery shocked readers. Scholars continue to debate whether these were isolated incidents, symbolic exaggerations, or pure invention to paint enemies as barbaric. The lack of physical evidence, no preserved skins, no reliable court records adds to the uncertainty. The real power of flaying stories lay in their ability to haunt imagination. To hear that a ruler's enemies were stripped of their very skin was enough to terrify populations into obedience. Even if few ever witnessed it, the whispered possibility worked like a shadow hanging over justice. Joke 2. Medieval gossip probably went, "Don't lose face," while someone else replied, "Too late literally." The punchline is that flaying alive survives less as a fact and more as a story, retold again and again until it felt common. Callback: just as the pair of anguish lives more in legend than reality, flaying thrives because the story is too gruesome to forget, regardless of its truth. Joke 3. If you've ever had a bad sunburn that peeled, congratulations, you've lived through the PG-13 version of medieval flaying. The myth paints executioners as sadistic monsters who lived for cruelty-hooded brutes with axes in hand, laughing as they hacked through necks or tightened ropes. Popular culture turns them into faceless villains, the embodiment of medieval terror. Joke 1. Basically the original bad guy with a mask, centuries before horror movies cashed in. Now, the flip executioners were often reluctant professionals, trapped in an ugly social role. They didn't necessarily enjoy what they did. They inherited the job, were forced into it, or accepted it because society gave them no other option. Many were shunned, unable to marry into respectable families, banned from markets, and forced to live on the fringes of towns. The irony was brutal. They performed work demanded by law and religion, yet were treated as outcasts for doing it. A recorded fact: executioners in Germany sometimes passed the job from father to son, the role becoming a hereditary curse. A quirky tidbit: some executioners doubled as informal doctors, using their anatomical knowledge from executions to set bones or mix remedies. And here lies the scholarly debate where executioners feared more for their violence or for their liminal role in society, half essential and half untouchable. Historians point out that many left surprisingly detailed diaries, suggesting they thought of themselves less as villains and more as misunderstood functionaries. The real picture is complicated. An executioner might have been paid in beer and food, asked to torture a prisoner one day and heal a villager the next. They carried both stigma and strange respect, needed and despised at the same time. Joke 2. Imagine being the guy who gets invited to fix a broken arm, but not to the wedding afterward. The punchline: executioners weren't cartoon villains. They were ordinary people forced into extraordinary, isolating roles. Callback: just like the scolds, bridal turned women into public warnings. Executioners themselves became walking reminders of society's contradictions, tools of justice who could never escape their own punishment. Joke 3. Asterisk. In today's terms, it's like being the town dentist. Everyone hates you, but they still need you. Asterisk. The myth says the medieval church stood firmly against cruelty, a moral beacon protecting the innocent from the worst horrors of the age. Many imagine monasteries as quiet havens of prayer, while secular lords carried out the dirty work. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically the idea that monks were just medieval librarians who never raised their voices above a whisper. Asterisk. Now, the church was not only aware of torture, but actively codified its use in certain contexts. By the 13th century, papal decrees allowed torture in inquisitorial trials, especially when dealing with heresy. The logic was twisted. Saving a soul from eternal damnation justified earthly suffering. Torture was framed as a reluctant tool, never to cause death, but very much to extract confession. In practice, these limits were often stretched thin, and inquisitors became experts in balancing theology with brutality. A historical fact: Pope Innocent IV's bull ad extirpanda 1252 formally permitted torture under controlled conditions. A remarkable contradiction to the Church's broader teachings on mercy. A quirky tidbit: some inquisitorial manuals offered almost comical advice, such as pausing torture at intervals to ask if the prisoner wished to tell the truth now. And historians still debate how widely such guidelines were followed. Were inquisitors sticklers for legal limits, or did they exploit loopholes to escalate cruelty under the shield of doctrine? The deeper irony is that torture became institutionalized, not despite religion, but through it. The same buildings that rang with hymns also housed chambers where screams echoed off the stones. Far from banning cruelty, the Church sometimes became its most sophisticated organizer. Joke 2. Asterisk. Imagine showing up for confession and leaving with joint pain in 3 new places. Asterisk. The punchline: the myth of a merciful church shatters under the weight of its own records. Faith and fear marched hand in hand, proving that morality can be bent until it justifies almost anything. Callback. Just as the brazen bull blurred myth and power, the Church blurred holiness and horror, leaving us with a legacy still argued over today. Joke 3. Asterisk. Honestly, if medieval sermons were as long as people say, the real torture was probably just staying awake in church. Asterisk. The myth says all these horrors vanished neatly when the Middle Ages ended, that torture devices were locked away with castles and plague doctors, replaced by enlightened justice and civilized courts. Popular imagination insists the cruelty was a closed chapter, a barbaric era left behind. Joke 1. Asterisk. Basically the historical equivalent of "we don't talk about that anymore." Asterisk. Now, while the Middle Ages ended, the legends of torture kept growing, shaping culture far beyond their original context. Many of the devices we think of as medieval, like the Iron Maiden or the Pair of Anguish, were popularized centuries later by collectors, writers, and museums eager to sell tickets. The myth of medieval cruelty became a powerful brand. At the same time, echoes of torture carried on into modern times, confessions still extracted under duress, punishments still designed to humiliate, governments still finding ways to disguise cruelty as justice. The Middle Ages ended on paper, but the appetite for horror never disappeared. One historical fact is that 19th-century museums displayed medieval torture chambers as tourist attractions, even building replicas of devices that may never have existed. A quirky tidbit: wax museums in London and Paris once staged actors inside Iron Maidens and racks to thrill visitors, blurring education and entertainment. And historians still debate whether our obsession with medieval torture says more about the past or about us, the modern audience, eager to imagine ourselves better, safer, more civilized than those who came before. What survives isn't just rusty iron. It's the stories whispered in textbooks, dramatized in films, retold in countless bedtime histories like this one. Torture lives on in imagination, shaping how we picture the Middle Ages, darker, bloodier, and more terrifying than they often were. Joke 2. Asterisk at this point. Medieval torture devices have had better PR agents than most pop stars. Asterisk the punchline. The myths may not always be true, but they endure because they speak to something deeper: our fascination with fear, our urge to test the limits of cruelty, and our uneasy comfort in believing it all belongs to a past that can't return. Callback: from the Iron Maiden's fakery to the wheel's spectacle, from the pair's exaggeration to the church's rules, we've seen again and again how the stories outlast the facts. Joke 3. Asterisk. And if you've ever been stuck waiting on hold with customer service, you already know torture never really went away. Asterisk. And now, as the echoes of these stories fade, you can let go of the weight they carried. Torture devices, whether real or imagined, belong to a world far removed from your bed tonight. The chains, the racks, the flames, they live only in iron relics and pages of old chronicles, not in the walls around you. What remains is the quiet knowledge that fear has always been a powerful tool, one that rulers and storytellers alike knew how to use. The rhythm slows here. You don't need to picture spikes or wheels anymore. Instead, think of empty dungeons, long since crumbled, where moss creeps over stone and silence has replaced screams. Picture castles at dawn, sunlight cutting through high windows, touching dust motes instead of prisoners. The instruments of pain sit abandoned, rusted, forgotten by all but history. Every myth we unraveled tonight showed how stories can stretch longer than chains, sharper than blades. The Iron Maiden survives not because it pierced flesh, but because it pierced imagination. The brazen bull burns hotter in legend than it ever did in reality. And the wheel still turns, not in a courtyard, but in the way history circles back to fear again and again. So let yourself drift with that thought. Cruelty fades, but stories soften over time. You are safe here, listening, while the Middle Ages dissolve into shadows far behind. The torches go out, one by one, until only quiet remains. Now breathe slower. Let the stillness take hold. Sleep comes, not with screams, but with silence. The past is finished. Your night is here.